Okay, everyone. So welcome back to part 2 of our presentation. So on the last part, we ended off with a puzzle, a tension actually between FAP's proposal and what we actually see in real life with how we treat non-combatants who are engaged in an unjust war. Okay, so just a quick recap. This puzzle is troublesome because we want to say that someone's liable based on their contribution to an unjust war, as evident in the case of Eichmann. But we also have to address the line drawing problem. Exactly how much contribution is too much? As we can see, dabbling in the language of participation and contribution and rights infringement, proportionality, limits us to assessing the moral responsibilities of each participant in contributing to an unjust war. Okay, we are forced to look at their contributions, their causal contributions to that war. Okay, and the problem, as she points out, is that it's difficult to draw lines. It's difficult to draw distinctions between the moral statuses of people. Okay, here's where Tadros comes in to offer a solution or a way to redirect our attention away from the puzzle. Okay, so in his view, we shouldn't be assessing the causal contribution of non-combatants. We shouldn't even be looking at how or why they are contributing to an unjust war. Okay, as we can see, it's problematic. For him, he just redirects our attention to something else to assess whether somebody is liable or not. Okay, so he just bypasses the. He's just saying that causal contribution don't matter. What matters to him is fairness. All right. So at the start of his paper, he just puts this down as thesis. Right. It is unfair to sharply discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Okay. In this way, he agrees with FAP. Right. And there's a typo in our paper, which is quite rare. So he says that discriminating in this way is unfair even if combatants act wrongly in prosecuting the war and even if they are negligent in deciding to fight. If the war would end more swiftly with fewer casualties overall, non-combatants rather than combatants ought sometimes to be killed to achieve this. And sorry, I just copy and paste this. There's a formatting error here. Okay, so what's the motivation? The motivation here is that we're having issues justifying how civilians are liable, right, by explaining how their causal contributions to an unjust war necessitates the forfeiting of their rights. The rights not to be harmed. Okay, so what Tadros is saying is that there's a line drawing problem. What if we can broaden the moral discourse of liability? What if liability is more than a causal contribution to an unjust threat? Right? What if liability is more than forfeiture, for instance? Okay, so to do that, Tadros invites us to take a couple of steps back and to just think from an everyday perspective of what liability means. When we utter the word liability, what do we take it to mean? So so he just asks us to forget about forfeiture, forget about proportionality, forget about causal contribution. Let's just ask ourselves, when we use the word liable, what do we mean? And in the crudest sense, he thinks that when we're liable to something, we just can't make complaints that are worth people's times about certain things that don't usually happen to us. Okay, so for instance, if you are liable to be slapped by me, and if I do slap you, you can't really complain, or you can complain, but no one actually would give a shit. Right. So formally, he says that X is liable to V by Y in order to blah blah blah. But we get the gist, right? It's really just the lack of the lack of entitlement to complain. All right, and then after that, he goes on to say that, does this idea really lead to us talking about forfeiture? Okay, when you lack a right to complain or you lack a right to claim against someone, do you really forfeit something? Okay, and Tadros thinks, no, we don't really need to talk about forfeiture when we talk about liability. Okay, he says that we can conceptualize liability as having a burdensome or very troublesome obligation imposed on us, right? But we can't make any complaint against it. So again, it's a form of normative, negative normative power, right? Just to think back to Fersen. It's something that happens to us. Okay, but that doesn't mean that we have to give up certain rights. That doesn't mean we have to relinquish certain rights against being harmed or being coerced to do something. And the example that he gave us in his paper is paying taxes, right? He says that we are liable to pay taxes, but just because we are liable to pay taxes, just because we can't complain when somebody forces us to pay our taxes, doesn't mean we have forfeited certain rights. Okay. On the other hand, we have certain very troublesome obligations that are imposed to us that we ought to carry out. And we can't complain if we can't carry out that action. So to Tadros, this is a more diluted sense of what liability means, right? It's broader and it's more diluted. Like he's trying to pull us away from forfeiture, because the motivation is that forfeiture, like merely narrowing down the moral discourse of liability to forfeiture, gives us problems that we have encountered with Fab's paper. Okay, by going through this like dilution and semantic broadening, he is actually trying to set up a groundwork for him to propose vicarious liability. Okay, so notice what he's saying in the previous two slides is that he's detaching forfeiture from liability. Okay, he's detaching forfeiture from liability. And he's saying that we can agree on what makes somebody liable while disagreeing on how that makes somebody liable. Okay, so let's just go back to the slapping example. So we can agree that if you stole my watch, for example, okay, and you are liable to me slapping you, for instance. Okay, we can agree that your action of stealing my watch renders you liable, but we need not agree on how your action made you liable. Okay, so this is quite contentious, and Tadros admits it, because it doesn't seem intuitive that someone can be liable to be harmed or coerced without unjustifiably infringing upon other people's rights and without them forfeiting certain rights of theirs. All right, so this is something that is quite contentious already, but I don't think it's I'll be inclined to agree with him. So he writes that we might agree that being responsible for posing a threat typically renders a person liable. So this is the what, right? This is the trigger that makes people liable. Okay, he says that while disagreeing about whether this is so in virtue of the fact that the person who is responsible for posing a threat incurs an enforceable duty to avert it, right, or whether doing so relinquishes his certain rights. So this is the how, right? This is the mechanism, right, that causes somebody to be liable. Okay, so this seems a bit cryptic. It's a bit abstract. So let's just consider some diagrams to help illustrate this point. So again, in very simple terms, we may agree on what makes someone liable, but we may disagree on how that makes it so. So again, we can agree on the trigger, but we may disagree on the mechanism. All right, so an example here is, for example, somebody poses an unjust threat. So Tadros thinks that, okay, we can agree that posing an unjust threat renders somebody liable, okay, but we don't need to agree on how, right? So for the authors that we've read thus far for the past 10 weeks, they all are inclined towards the mechanism of forfeiture. So for instance, if I pose an unjust threat to you, I have forfeited my certain rights that make me liable. Okay, but for Tadros, he's saying that we don't really need to rely on forfeiture. So if I pose an unjust threat towards you, right, I have perhaps broken a duty not to harm someone without a justification, and that renders me liable. Okay, and he says his paper doesn't rely on the mechanisms. Again, it's really contentious whether he is successful in convincing us about that. Okay, he says that all we need to agree is the trigger. We don't need to agree on the mechanisms. right? And that takes a lot more closer reading, which I won't go into this presentation as well. Okay, so already here's one question we can ask ourselves is this view plausible? Is it possible? And we've seen many structural substantive distinctions throughout the papers we've read. For example, we may agree on the aspects of proportionality as we've done in Kwong's paper, right? But we might not agree on how much each factor contributes. Okay, in simpler terms, right? So for instance, we may agree that I owe you money, right? Without agreeing on why I owe you money. Okay, that seems possible, but if we think deeper, it's quite difficult to detach the triggers from the mechanisms. It's quite difficult to detach the whats from the hows, right? But to me, it seems that Tadros is okay to move on from this assumption. But I think it's worth our time to think about whether this works. Okay, so if we just move on, what Tadros has done here, right, when he detaches the how from the what, he's implying that there are at least two kinds of liability. Okay, one that involves forfeiture, and one that doesn't involve forfeiture. Okay, and as we can see in the previous very crude illustration, right, unjust threat, forfeiture liable, unjust threat, duty not to harm, liable. So there are at least two kinds, right? And what Tadros is doing, right, when he detaches the how from the what, is that he is broadening the semantics of liability, right? Liability means more than forfeiture. Liability means more than causal contribution, moral responsibility. It means much more. Okay, and this is important because he's attempting to solve a problem due to the restrictive nature of liability. Okay, so there's two kinds of liability. So this is my rendition of it. I've actually tried to simplify the concepts. So I'm not sure if my characterization is 100% accurate, but I think hopefully it helps. Okay, so liability due to forfeiture, the ones that we've been discussing, the ones that we've been familiar with, relinquishes certain rights from individuals and perhaps imposes certain obligations on them. I put perhaps in parentheses because Tadros is skeptical whether forfeiture also imposes certain burdensome obligations on people. Okay, so we can think of forfeiture, liability due to forfeiture, as a breaking of a contract that once made our lives easier to live. Okay, so if we unjustifiably threaten someone, we have broken a contract that sort of implicitly exists between two people that says that we shouldn't harm each other unjustifiably. Okay, but liability not due to forfeiture imposes certain obligations on people without relinquishing certain rights from them. Okay, we can think of this as signing a social contract that makes our lives more difficult. All right. Okay, so vicarious liability is a kind of liability not due to forfeiture. So this is his very formal definition of vicarious liability. I mean, it's formal, but in simpler terms, which is again is my rendition, is that some individuals are liable just because of their normative relationships with someone else. Again, normative relationship is a concept that we've discussed in Ferzen's paper. Whether they are causally involved or morally responsible for a wrongdoing isn't decisive, but it's still relevant because it counts towards proportionality and necessity. It just doesn't decide whether somebody is vicariously liable or not. Okay. Yeah. So this is the simpler version. The more formal version is this. So two things that we should pick up from vicarious liability. The two important aspects is, one, it has nothing to do with moral responsibility and causal involvement. Second is that it is due solely to the normative relationships between people. Okay. Certain examples, Tadros only provided one, which is the work example. It's the normative relationships that exist between business stakeholders. I find it quite out of the world, like out in the world, like beyond our grasp right now, because we're still students. So I've actually come up with an example that illustrates vicarious liability, that it's easier for us to digest. Okay, so an example of vicarious liability is the liability that parents have to bear on behalf of their children. Okay, so we might think that parents are morally responsible for the conduct of their children, despite the parents not being causally involved in any possible wrongdoing, because they are the parents. Okay, it is because of the normative relationship between parents and children that renders parents vicariously liable for any potential wrongdoings a child might engage in. Okay, so why would we think that parents are vicariously liable? So I think to illustrate this, let's think of an example that is not too abstract. So let's just assume that let's just think about a 4-year-old kid stealing your very expensive watch, and in the process of it, it broke your watch. Right? So typically, we claim from and complain to the parents. We don't beat the kid up. We don't go to the kid and say, "Hey, you owe me a new watch," right? As if the parents are somehow responsible instead of the kid. Okay, why do we do it? It's a social convention, and we agree implicitly. Now, why do we do it? Because we don't hold the kid entirely responsible, because the kid can't possibly compensate for your loss. And at such a young age, we cannot hold them morally accountable, right, for psychological reasons. So it's only fair to you, the victim, because your watch is being stolen, that you are entitled to make claims and complaints against the parents. So it's only fair to you. So for Tadros, liability isn't about forfeiture. Like no one has forfeited their rights here, right? It's about being fair to you if certain unfortunate events befall upon you. Okay, and Tadros calls this the victim-centered reason, or the victim-centered justification for vicarious liability. We want to be fair to the victims, right? Okay, so his main attention isn't put on victim-centered reasons. He actually put it in a footnote that he deals with it in a separate paper. Rather, in the paper that we are assigned this week, deals with another kind of reasons. And so let's just consider the example that Tadros gave us, which is work. So this is my rendition of his example, just to make it more less abstract. So imagine you're running a food business with your business partner. You're in charge of sourcing, preparing, and cooking food. He's in charge of everything unrelated to food. Okay, and you are, on the other hand, responsible for the food. Okay, let's say one day you mistakenly serve a customer expired food products and they've fallen severely ill. The customer sues you and demands compensation. Now, the question is, would it be fair to you that you bear all the responsibility of putting that customer in sickbed? Okay, Tadros doesn't think so, right? I think on a intuitive level, it doesn't seem fair as well. Okay, so why is that so? Okay, Tadros explains it because your partner benefits of your contribution to the business when he bears no risk of poisoning your clients. Now, just think about it. It's impossible for your partner to poison anyone, and you bear 100% of that risk. Yet, part of the profits go to him. Okay, so it's only fair to you, the perpetrator, to make claims and complaints against your benefactors, i.e., your partner. All right. Once again, it's a question of fairness between two people. In this case, it's between the perpetrators, the person who has done wrong, which is you, and between your business partner. Okay, and Tadros thinks that it's only fair to you that you can make certain claims, that you demand that your partner shares the compensation, because your partner has benefited of your contribution when he bears no risk at all. All right. Yeah, I'm going to stop here, and I'll see you in part 3, where I'll move on to a little bit more illustration on perpetrator-centered reasons.